The 5,000-year story of money, from Lydia's coins to digital wallets. Money is one of humanity's oldest and most bewildering creations. How is it that the paper in our pockets or the digits glowing on a bank screen can represent a car, a home, or the labor of an entire lifetime? Money is indispensable to daily life. It keeps the economy's blood flowing. Yet at the same time, it is nothing more than an abstract social agreement. So what is money? A physical commodity or a contract? A tool or an end in itself? Imagine a simple question. If everyone woke up tomorrow and agreed that seashells were money, would they work? Is the value of money shaped by its physical substance or by the trust people place in it? To answer these questions, we must first understand the nature of money, its connection to debt, and the state's authority over currency. But before all else, we must begin where any good investigation begins, with the competing stories of how money was born. The barter myth and the credit reality. The traditional narrative is familiar. Money emerged because barter was inconvenient. School books tell us that before money, people traded directly. You give me wheat, I give you shoes. But this system supposedly collapsed under the double coincidence of wants. The shoemaker might not want wheat today, or the farmer might not want shoes tomorrow. To solve this problem, societies turned to universally valued goods, precious metals, which were eventually standardized into coins. History credits the Lydians of the 7th century BCE in what is now Manisa Salihi in Turkey with minting the first known metal coins. These electrum pieces, stamped with royal lion emblems and guaranteed by the state, revolutionized commerce. They replaced irregular bits of metal or grain payments with a standardized currency, speeding up exchange and transforming economic life. Money became a social technology, simple yet revolutionary. But researchers like anthropologist David Graeber argue that this tale is more myth than fact. Across the archaeological record, evidence for a widespread primitive barter economy is almost non-existent. Instead, the roots of money lie in systems of credit, records of who owed what to whom. Long before Lydia's coins, ancient Sumer and Egypt used grain and silver as units of account, documenting debts in temple and palace ledgers. You owe this much barley. You owe this much silver. In other words, money began not as metal, but as a way to record human relationships, an abstract measure for managing obligations. Thus, two broad theories emerged about the nature of money. One, the commodity view. Money has value because it is made of something valuable, gold, silver, etc. Two, the social or credit view. Money is a relationship, a record, a shared agreement. Even Aristotle recognized that money arose from nomos, law, custom, collective decision, not from nature. And in the early 20th century, economist Georg Friedrich Knapp argued that money's authority stemmed entirely from the state. This theory, chartalism, holds that currency is ultimately a legal instrument, a symbol whose value derives from the issuing authority, not the material it is made of. A coin, a banknote, or a digital balance, all are valid as long as the state says so. Marx and the social alchemy of value. Karl Marx approached the question differently. To understand money's value, he argued, one must examine the social relations that produce it. Money functions as the universal equivalent because it enables diverse labor products to be compared and exchanged. Historically, gold and silver fulfilled this role, not because they were intrinsically magical, but because societies agreed upon their stability and trustworthiness. For Marx, money has a dual nature. It is a physical substance, a gold bar, a silver coin, and it is the representation of value, an expression of human labor. This duality produces illusions. We begin to believe objects contain value naturally, rather than understanding that their value comes from human social relationships. This is the heart of Marx's commodity fetishism. Money seems like a mystical force, an object capable of exchanging for anything, when in fact it merely embodies the abstract labor of society. It hides the social relationships that gave it birth. So which story is true? Is money a tool invented to make trade easier? Or is it debt made visible, an obligation captured in symbols? History suggests it is both. Many early objects used as money, shells, grains, metals, functioned as exchange tools, yet they were always backed by trust and by some authority, whether a chief, a temple, or a state. Lydia's coins worked precisely because they bore the king's mark, guaranteeing value. Likewise, in ancient China and the Middle East, people used state-issued money because taxes had to be paid in that currency. The state didn't just declare money, it created the conditions for people to accept it. Thus, money is less a thing and more a relationship, a collective belief system. Whether gold coin, paper note, or digital entry, money's power comes from shared acceptance. It is the scorekeeping system of a game we all agree to play. If trust collapses, the game ends, and money becomes worthless paper or meaningless bits. History is full of examples. Empires whose currencies evaporated overnight, cigarettes becoming currency in wartime, banknotes burned as firewood during hyperinflation. Each episode teaches the same lesson. Money's real foundation is not metal or paper, but trust and the social order that maintains it. The evolution of debt and money, a historical tale. When we look closely at the history of money, we discover that it did not emerge as a simple tool of exchange, but evolved hand in hand with debt. In fact, as anthropologist David Graeber argues in Debt, the First 5,000 Years, human history itself can be read through the lens of indebtedness. According to Graeber, the modern moral commandment, debts must be repaid, is presented today as if it were a timeless ethical law. Yet throughout history, societies applied the notion of debt with remarkable flexibility.
In ancient Mesopotamia, for instance, kings periodically declared sweeping debt cancellations, jubilees, erasing the obligations of peasants and freeing them from the burden of servitude. The purpose was not charity, but survival. If everyone became enslaved to creditors, society would collapse. In other words, the morality of debt was never fixed. It was rewritten according to the needs of the powerful. Graeber also notes that between 800 BCE and 600 CE, the so-called Axial Age, as well as in the Middle Ages, the use of money ebbed and flowed. Sometimes credit systems dominated, deferred payments, verbal agreements, and ledger-based accounting. At other times, especially under vast empires, metal coinage, gold and silver, took center stage. After the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe saw a decline in coin circulation. Local barter, village credit, and in-kind payments became common. But from the 16th century onward, with the flood of American silver, cash economies resurged. By the 20th century, central banks and commercial credit networks ushered humanity into a new era of abstract virtual money. History, in short, swings like a pendulum between ages of credit and ages of coin. Debt, a force of progress and a weapon of ruin. Debt has always been a paradox, both a tool of cooperation and a seed of oppression. On one hand, it enabled trust. People could act today in reliance on a promise of tomorrow. Commerce flourished. Yet when debts could not be paid, coercion followed. Across civilizations, debtors were sold into slavery, imprisoned, or stripped of their land. As Graeber reminds us, every debt hides within it a power relation. The law that governs debtor and creditor is, behind the curtain, a negotiation and sometimes a threat. This is why debt is not merely an economic bond, it is also a moral and political one. Even today, sovereign debt functions as a geopolitical lever. When small nations fail to repay, powerful creditors or international institutions impose austerity and control. But when the world's largest economies accumulate debt, no one dares discipline them. Power flips the equation. The famous saying captures it perfectly. If Mozambique owes the U.S. $10 billion, that is Mozambique's problem. If the U.S. owes Japan $10 billion, that is Japan's problem. When the weak borrow, debt becomes a chain. When the powerful borrow, debt becomes leverage.
Debt as a tool of domination. The Ottoman example. History offers striking examples. In the 19th century, as the Ottoman Empire drowned in foreign debt, European creditors did not merely demand repayment, they seized control of the empire's finances. In 1881, the Public Debt Administration, Duyun-i Umumye, was established, placing critical revenue sources, customs duties, salt, tobacco, under the direct authority of foreign representatives. It was essentially an international trusteeship imposed on a sovereign state. The price of default was nothing less than the loss of economic independence. But debt has another face. At certain moments, for example after the Second World War, creditor nations agreed to lighten or forgive the debts of devastated economies, as in the 1948 German debt relief. In many cultures, the word debt also carries the meaning of social obligation. Borrowing flour or sugar from a neighbor, or keeping a tab at a local shop, is not just a financial act, but a ritual of trust and community. Graeber argues that human societies were originally grounded in these open-ended gift relationships, where favors were not measured like cold financial obligations. Only later did money and formalized debt impose rigid numerical logic upon human relations. Thus, money metrics reshaped societies, turning bonds of reciprocity into ledger entries. Civilization's paradox. Money liberates by liberating individuals from the constraints of barter. We need not trade wheat for shoes unless we wish to. But debt also enslaves. Individuals and nations alike can become trapped by obligations they cannot meet. In the modern world, understanding this contradiction provides crucial insight into how money should be governed. And that leads us to the fundamental question: who sets the rules of money, and who enforces them?
Sovereignty and trust, the twin pillars of money. Across history, the authority to mint money has been the essence of sovereignty. Coins bearing the names of rulers were political portraits. Their circulation marked the reach of power. Roman emperors displayed might through currency reforms. Medieval kings debased coins, mixing cheap metals to stretch their treasuries at the cost of inflation. The Ottoman Empire behaved no differently. During wars and crises, the akçe was repeatedly debased. When the Ottomans introduced their first paper currency, the kayme, in 1840, it was essentially the state asking the public for a loan in exchange for promissory notes. The notes quickly fell below their face value and were eventually withdrawn. Paper money required trust, a trust not easily earned. By 1863, the Ottoman Bank received the privilege of issuing banknotes. During the First World War, the state once again printed unbacked paper money to survive. Every episode revealed a simple truth: money is worth only as much as people believe it is worth. Fiat money and the power of the modern state. In 1971, when the U.S. abandoned the gold standard, the world entered a pure fiat money era, currency backed by nothing but state authority and public acceptance. Central banks became guardians of stability, managing interest rates, money supply, and inflation.
Many were granted independence to shield them from political manipulation. Turkey's own story illustrates the stakes. In the 1970s and 1990s, heavy monetization of fiscal deficits entrenched chronic inflation. By the late 1990s, the lira had become so eroded that 20 million lira banknotes circulated, vast sums that bought little. The 2001 crisis ushered in reforms, price stability, and eventually the new Turkish lira with 6 zeros removed. It was not just a technical change, but a psychological restoration, a campaign to rebuild faith in money. Modern monetary theory, a new lens on sovereign money. Among modern theories, modern monetary theory, or MMT, offers one of the most striking perspectives. MMT argues that monetarily sovereign states, those that issue their own currency, cannot go bankrupt in their own money. They can always create more. Public deficits, according to MMT thinkers like Stephanie Kelton and Randall Wray, are not inherently dangerous. They can stimulate economies and reduce unemployment. Taxes, in this view, do not fund government spending, but create demand for the currency and regulate economic activity. This argument is rooted historically. Britain's Bank of England, founded in 1694, was essentially a consortium of lenders monetizing the king's debt. Modern paper money, such as the US dollar, is still, in essence, a government IOU. MMT became especially visible after the 2008 crisis and the massive stimulus programs of the 2020 pandemic. Governments created trillions, yet hyperinflation did not immediately follow until supply shortages and demand surges in 2021-22 revived inflationary fears. Critics argued that loose monetary policy had limits. MMT supporters countered that inflation stemmed from supply constraints, not sovereign spending itself. They maintained that governments could fight inflation with higher taxes and reduced spending, though in practice, political resistance makes such measures slow.
The unequal geography of monetary power. There is a crucial difference between nations. Countries with reserve currencies, the US, Eurozone, Japan, the UK, benefit from global trust. Japan, for example, has debt above 240% of GDP, yet historically faced barely any inflation. Turkey, on the other hand, with a history of instability, saw widespread dollarization as citizens shifted savings toward foreign currencies. Even if the state collects taxes in lira, people store wealth in dollars, a quiet erosion of monetary sovereignty. This reveals the limits of MMT in developing economies. Legal authority does not guarantee social trust. Greece's crisis offers a different lesson. Using the euro, but lacking the power to issue it, Greece faced harsh external controls. Japan, with similar debt levels, faced none because it controlled its own currency. Sovereign money gives flexibility. A country with its own currency may suffer inflation or devaluation, but not technical bankruptcy. The fragile balance of modern money. Ultimately, a healthy monetary system requires a delicate balance between discipline and trust. A state may have the power to create money, but if it abuses that power, the currency collapses. If it refuses to use that power, economies stall and unemployment rises. Central banks therefore pursue price stability, not by accident, but because society depends on predictable measurements of value. Money is a social contract. For the contract to function, people must believe that the unit of account they use today will retain meaning tomorrow.